As a parent, the scariest thing I've heard is that fentanyl is killing young Americans in record numbers. Why is fentanyl the number one cause of death for Americans ages 18 to 45? Assistant U.S. Attorney Adam Gordon leads the effort of educating the public about the dangers of fentanyl for the DOJ in what has become the center of this crisis, Southern California. You gotta listen to this. Adam, thanks so much for coming to speak with me. I feel like I have been hearing so much about fentanyl recently. 5 years ago, I didn't even know the word fentanyl, to be honest. Now I hear about it every single week. So tell me a little bit about what is fentanyl? What is this thing that we're also worried about right now?
Sure, Marissa, thanks for having me. Obviously, this is going to be a tough topic, but I think it's so important that we talk about it. So fentanyl is a drug, right? It's a synthetic opioid that was created about 60 years ago. It was actually a terrific drug to have. So for late stage cancer patients, people who are undergoing major surgeries, it had a lot of benefits. Unfortunately, about 10 years ago, we saw a bunch of abuse occur. That has led to an epidemic of unfortunately, massive scale that's really damaging our communities. So it's gone from something that served a great purpose to something that's now endangering our communities.
How does this drug actually work? Is it like a powder, a liquid? How does one even consume it?
Sure. So about 10 years ago, the way it was consumed, there were a lot of patches. It could be consumed orally. Now we see it in two big forms. We see it in counterfeit pills, and then we see powdered fentanyl, which is unfortunately equally problematic.
So if you were, let's say, a pain management doctor, you would actually prescribe it to someone who is in great pain. I read that that fentanyl is actually 100 times more potent than morphine, right? So this stuff is like really strong.
You're exactly right. So if fentanyl is incredibly strong and is a very effective drug, so if you're having a major surgery, it is not unusual at all to be prescribed fentanyl, or if it's an end stage in life, a doctor or nurse will be giving you fentanyl, and then it serves an incredible purpose. The problem is it's being abused by individuals in the criminal justice element who are now making and driving this epidemic.
How did we get to a point where first it's something that maybe an anesthesiologist or like a surgeon would monitor someone ingesting fentanyl to a point where it's actually out there on the streets in the hands of kids?
Great question. So unfortunately, I would describe it as an own goal. So we had individuals who needed pain management treatment. And then over the course of the past decade, what we've seen in all this litigation and various lawsuits is that doctors, pharmacists irresponsibly prescribed. So we had individuals who had severe pain issues, but they were being overprescribed. Then the DEA and a variety of litigation occurred. And so it's much, much more difficult to prescribe fentanyl-related medications. While the cartels and drug trafficking organizations saw this as an opportunity and decided to fill that void that was now in the marketplace. And that's where you started to see especially these counterfeit pills.
So when people are taking fentanyl, are they looking for fentanyl? Are they going to their doctors and saying, doctor, I'm in so much pain. If you don't prescribe this, fentanyl for me, I can't sleep. I can't live. I can't do anything. Prescribe it to me. And if you won't, I'm going to go on Yelp and say that you're a horrible doctor. Or, I know that doctors have been facing a lot of that with some of their patients who've become addicted. And so they feel pressured to prescribe it. Are people pushing to try to get fentanyl, or is it that it's somehow showing up in other stuff and then they're ingesting it?
So what I would describe is there are three different types of users of fentanyl. So there are kids who are using counterfeit pills, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Then there are recreational drug users who may be trying to consume cocaine, methamphetamine, some other drug, and end up having fentanyl mixed into that drug. Then the third pile, which is unfortunately driving the vast majority of our fatalities, where fentanyl is now their drug of choice, especially powdered fentanyl.
Why are they choosing fentanyl knowing, I really feel like the drug should be called killer drug. It's a killer drug. It sounds like, given how strong it is. I have this example here of a penny, and this is actually just an Altoid, so don't worry, that we kind of crushed up. But it gives you a little bit of a sense of this is just enough to kill someone. And so if you ingest this amount of fentanyl, you will die. That is basically a killer drug. What are the chances that you would be taking something like this more than 5 times and actually survive?
Yeah, the scary thing is that amount of Altoid that you've crushed up, you could take that and cut half away, and that would still be a fatal dose. So what we see is that about 41% of the pills that we seize contain fatal doses of fentanyl. It's basically 2 nanograms per milliliter of fentanyl is fatal. So it is an incredibly, incredibly powerful drug. that obviously is not meant to be ingested other than in a very, very specific controlled circumstance.
And so you're saying to me that the vast majority who are taking fentanyl actually know that they're taking fentanyl. It's not, laced in something that they've accidentally purchased. And so they know they're about to take this killer drug. Why is it? Are they misinformed? Are they so deeply addicted to it? What is the appeal in fentanyl in particular?
Right. So I'd say out of those three groups, I don't think kids are trying to take fentanyl. I don't think recreational drug users are trying to take fentanyl. I think that in that third group, as you've identified, people are in the depths of their addiction so much that what I hear is that the withdrawals from fentanyl are so significant that you can go from consuming, say, a gram of fentanyl today to up to 3 or 4 in a relatively short amount of time. And you can imagine, especially if you're consuming powdered fentanyl as your drug of choice, inevitably there's just bad results. We have good partners, we have naloxone that I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit, but ultimately, if you're consuming powdered fentanyl for a long time period, there's just not good results that are going to happen.
So are people attracted to fentanyl because it's cheap, it has no odor? A friend of mine who lost his son to fentanyl, and I won't use the term overdose because I don't think that the term fentanyl overdose is accurate. I think it's such a killer drug that ultimately if you take fentanyl, you will die if you take it on your own. And so my friend who lost his son to fentanyl told me that his son would use fentanyl because you would not be able to trace it in his breath. When they would do the testing on his drug panel, it wouldn't show up, and so they could sneak it in. And it was incredibly accessible and cheap. And so even though a professional looked at him and said, if you continue taking fentanyl, it's just Russian roulette. It's a matter of time before you die. He still kept taking it. And so my question is, how did he get his hands on it from the first place? And how do these kids get to a point where they continue to take it knowing that they are going to die very, very soon?
So the common use pattern for kids starts with consuming a pill recreationally, right? So you have pills that are coming to people in parties, whether it's at somebody's house, and it's usually not a friend trying to harm another friend. It's just these pills, you have unknown provenance. You don't know where these pills are coming from. So a kid will take a pill and then likes the sensation, whatever it is. A lot of times for these fake oxys, these blues, these Mallinckrodt M30s that are now being counterfeited all the time, it's a sense of basically nothingness. You're kind of just out of your body. You're very relaxed. And it's not like a euphoric high like heroin you can imagine. It's just kind of a feeling of nothingness. So that's usually kind of the gateway into the fentanyl addiction. What I would say is that most kids are not seeking fentanyl, that they're seeking these M30s. But unfortunately, we have counterfeit M30s, meaning the blues. And
what is M30s and what are the blues? Yeah. Sorry, I just know nothing about this stuff.
No, so these drugs in particular are what are driving our kid fatality. So it's like Percocet and oxycodone. Mm-hmm. So they're M30s, they're Mallinckrodt M30s. They're being mass produced in Mexico and then brought across the border. So we call them blues because they look blue. There's like M and 30s written on the pills. So that is an incredibly prevalent counterfeit pill to the degree that which basically half of all of the pills that we seize contain a fatal amount of fentanyl. So those M30s are almost exclusively counterfeit, right? If you're getting them not from a pharmacy. But you also have counterfeit Adderall pills, you have counterfeit Xanax pills. So the pills that traditionally you would be stealing from somebody's medicine cabinet or maybe getting from a friend now are being counterfeited, and that's how they're being made available to kids.
How are the kids finding these things? I mean, you're saying that these kids are actually looking for these pills. They're looking for Xanax. They're looking for the stuff. They're obviously not getting a prescription from a doctor. How are they finding it?
I bet you if you took out your phone within 10 minutes, you could find how to buy these pills.
Social media.
It's social media. It's TikTok, it's Instagram, it's Snapchat. They are incredibly prevalent in terms of, it's not the cartels and it's not the drug trafficking organizations, it's north side distribution cells and drug dealers that provide these fatal doses of the counterfeit pills. And a lot of it is advertising to kids. So basically kids get their hands on this one of two ways. One is through like friends just giving them a pill. And of course the friends are not trying to kill other friends, but those are usually counterfeit pills. And the other way is actually reaching out via social media to contact somebody who will then, they'll set up a meet, they'll deliver the pill that way.
Yeah, no kid thinks that they're buying a counterfeit pill. They're assuming that they can trust the source, but then
Yeah, and you'll actually see it in the social media postings. It's always like the most trusted blues, or these aren't Mexican blues. These are, real blues. Well, of course, they're not real blues. They're, of course, counterfeit pills. Mm-hmm. So the idea that you're having some righteous source of these pills that are coming straight from the pharmacy it's ludicrous. But that's unfortunately, when we're seeing the kids, and unfortunately, I look at a lot of fatalities, and then we get into the kids' cell phones and we're trying to identify the dealers. And when we do, you see these text communications where the dealers are assuring the kids that, of course, I have the righteous blues. These are not bad pills. Well, of course, they are bad pills.
How did you get into this line of work?
Sure. So I actually started with the San Diego County District Attorney's Office and prosecuted crimes over there, and then was a defense counsel in between, and then came over and worked for the federal government as a federal prosecutor. So I started doing a whole bunch of these crimes that we were talking about, importation and distribution, and then ultimately got into the position I am now, where I focus almost exclusively on the fentanyl epidemic.
So how many years have you been Mr. Fight Fentanyl?
Yeah, so that would have been around November of 2021, I want to say.
Any surprises?
Yes. I think that the biggest surprise I had was the people's drug of choice was fentanyl. When I sat down with law enforcement initially, and I just asked them, like, who's using fentanyl? I didn't understand that people would actually be trying to consume fentanyl. It blew my mind. I knew that fentanyl was deadly. Why on earth would you consume fentanyl? And it just shows how deep people are in their addiction, that that's their drug of choice. So that was something that was incredibly surprising and took me a long time, and actually took me talking to addicts to try to learn why they were using fentanyl and just the nature of the withdrawals and what they're trying to fight off and why they're using fentanyl. This is, I think, incredibly important. One is a lot of people started because they either started on like heroin or the pills initially, and then they switched over to fentanyl because it was stronger. In terms of why they use fentanyl, it's different than like heroin or almost any other drug. It's basically that the withdrawals are so bad, what they describe as quote unquote getting well. I don't know if obviously you've got children. The example I use is when I had my appendix taken out, right? So I had my appendix taken out, I wake up, 12 hours later, whatever it is, my whole body aches. Imagine that, but 10 or 15 times worse. So when you're talking to addicts who are using fentanyl, it's not that they're seeking some euphoric high. It's just they literally have to use all their energy just to basically quote unquote get well, basically starve off those withdrawals.
So would you say that most people who start with those kinds of opioids had some sort of pain before, like a shoulder pain or some sort of surgery that they had to recover from, and then they just kind of couldn't stop?
Yeah, so that's unfortunately one of the silos that people come into, ultimately fentanyl consumption, where maybe they had a really bad car accident or a really bad back injury and they were prescribed oxycodone. But then after 6 months, the doctors maybe were hesitant to provide them oxycodone, or they wouldn't justify the prescription anymore, whatever it is. So now they're left with this, basically this addiction, this need for whatever painkiller they had. And how are they going to fix that? So sometimes they would go and seek these counterfeit blues. And unfortunately, a lot of those individuals who ultimately pass away went from that step all the way to powdered fentanyl.
If you're addicted to oxy and you can't get a hold of oxy, can you just switch to fentanyl and feel like it's seamless? Or is there withdrawal from oxy because it has a different substance in it?
I wouldn't say seamless is hard for me to say, but what I can say is that use pattern is very standard in terms of what we see ultimately for a lot of our fatalities, where originally it was some actually prescribed medication into some counterfeit pill, then into the powdered fentanyl.
And that's mostly the folks who are seeking out fentanyl, not the folks who accidentally bought something and there's fentanyl in it.
Yes. I mean, obviously, some of those individuals who passed away were trying to get some counterfeit, oxycodone pill or M30 or whatever it was. There's certainly people who died in that way. But then there's obviously the next step of individuals who were so far into the depths of their addiction that they then seek out powdered fentanyl, because what I hear a lot is that the pills have a regular strength and the powder is actually stronger than the pills. So when you're having individuals who need to fight off their withdrawals, if the pills have a regular strength, they'll take that next step because they can guarantee fighting off that withdrawal with the powdered fentanyl.
There's a question that came to my mind that it's somewhat off topic, but not entirely, and we can figure out if it's worth talking about. There is something to be said about now doctors being so afraid to prescribe pain medication, right? And so, there's always the flip side of it where we don't want doctors to overprescribe. We want doctors to be strong with their patients and really encourage them to recover and not stay on these pain meds. But we also don't want doctors to be in a place where they feel like they can't help their patients. And if they help their patients through severe pain, they're going to end up getting, vilified. And is that something that has been factored into the conversation?
I think it needs to be part of the conversation. I think is, especially in the medical community, which I can't really speak to. What I can speak to is that, we have a lot of good partners in the medical community, and they talk about the transition of care from individuals. So the medical community is much more conscious of the fact that, hey, if someone's been prescribed these very powerful painkillers and then we stop their prescription, what are the different paths that we can take to ensure that they're not then going to seek out some illicit prescription or some illicit or counterfeit substance?
Right. I would imagine that created that vacuum in the market where now the doctors are afraid to give the prescriptions. And so people are in this intense amount of pain. And, they're feeling hopeless. And so they're buying stuff on social.
And you're exactly right. So the domestic demand was established when that supply of the actual legal pills was dramatically declined. And that's the void that the cartels and the drug trafficking organizations filled.
So you're working directly out of San Diego, which is probably one of the largest danger zones when it comes to fentanyl. And just describe to me what are you seeing over there?
So San Diego is a very specific environment. About 60% of all the fentanyl seized comes through our ports of entry. So I work in the Southern District of California as a federal prosecutor. So we have both San Diego County and Imperial County. And in San Diego County, we've got like the San Ysidro port of entry, Otay Mesa port of entry, these incredibly large ports of entry. But we seize about 60% of all the fentanyl coming through our border district. A lot of the fentanyl stays in San Diego, but unfortunately, San Diego is a distribution hub. So you'll see packages that start in San Diego, go to LA for further distribution, Chicago, New York, DC, New Orleans, whatever.
Is it coming in through what we would call a porous border? Is it coming in through, the cartels, the coyotes, or is it coming, in legally with people who have, suitcases of this stuff?
Yeah, so what our seizure numbers reflect is that the vast majority of the seizures happen at the ports of entry. Because you can imagine, you can put a lot more drugs in a vehicle than you can in a backpack, right? So those are what's really driving our seizure number. I mean, the San Ysidro port of entry is the largest port of entry in the entire world. It is, I can't even remember how many lanes of traffic. It is a major ongoing concern. But what we have there is we have a bunch of different ways to interdict the drugs. But it would be foolish of me to say that we catch 100% of the drugs, because I know that's not true, because there are drugs available here. So we do everything we can to interdict the drugs at the border, but eventually drugs get through.
You explained to me that some people are actually looking for fentanyl because they're addicted to it and they enjoy it, and they know they're actually buying fentanyl. And then there's another group that is buying other types of pills that are counterfeit, and they're finding them online, right? So whether it's Adderall or Xanax, and suddenly they don't know that it's laced with fentanyl. Why is this stuff laced with fentanyl? Why would the drug dealers put fentanyl in weed or in Xanax?
Yeah, so what I would say is drug dealers and the drug trafficking organization, the cartels, are very rational economic actors. What makes fentanyl in particular a really good product is you don't have to grow anything. It's a synthetic opioid, right? It's just like methamphetamine. You don't need a plant. You don't have to process a plant. As opposed to heroin, where I need to actually grow a poppy, and it's disgusting and it's very difficult to manipulate. Powdered fentanyl is relatively easy to make. The precursors are straightforward to import. And then, unfortunately, you have this situation where there's the domestic demand. So the cartels and the drug trafficking organization and the drug dealers in the United States are all just responding to the incentives in the marketplace. So the reason it's in the bad pills is because it's so much cheaper to make the pills if all they have to do is put in fentanyl. So that's the reason why it's in the bad pills. For that recreational drug user category, the people who are trying to use cocaine, but there just happens to be fentanyl in there, or they're trying to use heroin, or they're trying to use methamphetamine, there just happens to be fentanyl. It's because the drug dealers are just completely indifferent to whether or not this product is pure cocaine or pure methamphetamine. They don't care. So fentanyl is so powerful that it actually provides a kick into that drug. And it also potentially has the secondary effect, if you're cutting it with fentanyl, of developing an addiction for fentanyl.
And so is it true that you can find fentanyl now in weed, for example?
Of the things that I'm worried about, let me put it this way, I'm not really worried about that.
So you're
Like we
not-
have plenty of stuff to be worried about, but that's not something that
It's
at
not
this
like
point.
prevalent. People can go buy weed and suddenly there's fentanyl inside and they didn't know because they thought they're just getting weed and then they overdose on fentanyl or die from fentanyl.
Yes. In terms of the cases that I've seen, I've never seen somebody who was trying to consume like weed or some sort of edible and ended up dying because of it, because there was fentanyl tainted in that.
So it's more pills like Oxy. You think you're buying Oxy, you think you're buying Adderall, and suddenly there is fentanyl in there because it gives it a little extra kick and it's cheaper to manufacture.
Well, especially for the fake pills, it is incredibly cheap to be able to do. So they don't really care what the high is associated with it. It mimics the high of the oxycodones, of the Xanax. It's very difficult for users to be able to say X, Y, or Z is actually fentanyl versus what they were trying to get. So that's why the cartels are ultimately making so much of it. So in the cartel's mind, they're doing two things. They're making pills, which there's a huge domestic demand for, and they're making powdered fentanyl, which is incredibly cheap, very, very powerful, can be stomped on many times along the distribution network, and then can be distributed throughout the United States.
Can you give me a sense of what are the numbers that we're looking at here?
Sure.
Like not just the numbers that are being sold, but like how many people are consuming these pills?
Yeah, I mean, the most tragic rate is obviously the death rate, right? So we're losing over 100,000 Americans every year to overdoses. Of that number, the latest stats is about 60,000 Americans every year to fentanyl-related overdoses. Now, those are delayed stats. So once the new numbers come out for 21-22, I would project that to unfortunately be higher. In San Diego County, where obviously I spend a lot of time, we lost 817 people last year to fatal fentanyl overdoses, and we're unfortunately trending up from that number. So the main driver, again, is having the availability of fentanyl, and it's obviously damaging our communities to a massive extent.
A statistic that I heard is that the number one cause of death for Americans ages 18 to 45 is actually fentanyl death.
That's correct.
And so that is a very, very significant number. I'm surprised that there isn't a bigger public outcry and better information about how dangerous fentanyl is.
I think that for a long time, we have basically cabined off the problem. We thought we solved it because there were all of these bad Oxy prescriptions being prescribed, fentanyl prescriptions, and then we went in, we said, well, we've fixed the bad doctors, we've fixed the bad pharmacies. And I think to a large extent, that has been solved. But because that domestic demand was created, that's what enabled the cartels and the drug trafficking organizations to be able to now fill that demand. And we haven't even begun to address all the different parts and the ramifications of the domestic demand for fentanyl.
I have candy here, not for us to eat, but a few days ago, I read an article about how at LAX, somebody was arrested for bringing a bunch of candy boxes through, and inside the candy boxes, there was a bunch of fentanyl. And so I think a lot of parents like me are worried about Halloween is coming up and candy in general. How much should we be worried about that? Is there fentanyl laced in candy? I mean, if we go trick-or-treating, is that something that we need to be worried about?
Yeah, obviously we're close to Halloween. I'm glad to be able to dispel this myth. This is not something that I'd be worried about if I were a parent. The reason that drug traffickers are trying to smuggle it in the boxes is because they're trying to get through security or they're trying to get through a port of entry. It's not because then all of a sudden they're going to start handing out bad M30s or bad blues for Halloween candy. It wouldn't be a rational decision for drug dealers, right? They want to be able to sell their product to consumers. So the reason I presume, and it's just consistent with my experience, that we have drugs hidden in boxes that are Whoppers or Nerds or whatever is because that's just one of a myriad of different ways that drug trafficking organizations try to smuggle drugs into the country.
One of the things I'm curious about is how dangerous is fentanyl and how easy is it to just ingest it accidentally? Like what happens if I put my hand on some surface that had fentanyl in it and lick my hand by accident? Is there a risk that I would ingest fentanyl and possibly die from it?
If you got it into your body system, like basically you got it into your bloodstream, that's when it's problematic. But if you're just like touching it, just go and wash your hands. So it's not, unless it can some way saturate the skin into the bloodstream, it's not problematic.
We talked about the fact that you've been catching a lot of the criminals. What is done to them once you catch them?
Sure. So on the federal side, if you provide a fatal dose of fentanyl, you're eligible for a 20-year minimum mandatory if your fentanyl results in a death. So it's something we take very seriously and prosecute a bunch of those cases. We've sentenced 9 defendants in the past 12 months for just those resulting in death cases.
And what if somebody is drug dealing, but it has not resulted in death?
Yeah, so our fentanyl-related prosecutions are up 1,600% in the past 4 or 5 years. So just the number of cases involving fentanyl, both the seizures, the distribution cases, the conspiracy cases are up tremendously.
And if somebody is caught dealing fentanyl, like on college campus or high school campus, what is done to them?
Yeah, so they could be eligible for all of these are federal crimes, right? So especially in the drug world, you have both state crimes and federal crimes. So we vigorously prosecute, and we have partners in our district attorney's office in San Diego and Imperial County who also vigorously prosecute these drug crimes. It doesn't matter whether or not you even knew it was fentanyl or the amount you provided. If you provide a deadly dose of a drug, in most cases it's fentanyl, and somebody dies, you're eligible for this resulting in death crime that has the 20-year mandatory minimum. Then you've got like distribution cases or importation cases, and your actual like custodial sanction does depend on the amount of drugs that you brought in as well as your criminal history.
How many of those are you seeing every day?
I mean, I would even hesitate to say the number of cases that we bring in a particular week. What I can say is that, you know, we seized close to 3 tons of fentanyl, you know, in the past 12 months along our particular ports of entry. So you can imagine just the number of defendants associated with that.
And so let's talk a little bit about why there's such a demand for these pills and what kind of education can we provide to the public so that, you know, our kids don't continue to die at these kinds of numbers. I think it's surprising that, you know, the government has done such a concentrated effort to talk about COVID and masking and testing and vaccines and all of that, but it just seems like there isn't that much of a concentrated effort to talk about how dangerous fentanyl is and just this, I think this kind of pill crisis or drug crisis. I think our society has become so used to just taking medications and solving things with pills that our kids are basically learning that a pill will solve your heartache, will solve your any sort of pain. And so how do we get the government to use this platform that they have to better keep our children safe? And what are your suggestions around that?
Well, ultimately, I think that it starts with education, right? And that's why I'm here today. And that's why there are a bunch of people who talk about fentanyl all the time. So basically, the latest stat is about 5% of individuals who are students report using a drug other than marijuana in 8th grade, right? So if you're looking at a class of about 20 kids, we also see nationally that the use of high school students of drugs is going down. So we're really focused on a relatively small number of kids in a particular class that are particularly vulnerable. So what do we need to do? We need to start talking to kids about fentanyl as soon as possible. I don't think 5th grade or 6th grade is too early to be talking about fentanyl. I was teaching in front of a school yesterday of 10th graders, and I have a standard question like, hey, how many of you have just heard of fentanyl? And it was only about 30 to 40% of the hands. That's on us. That's on us as adults for not properly educating kids about the dangers of fentanyl. So when we look in the mirror and like, how does this crisis develop? Like, who's ultimately responsible? Yes, the government obviously has a role, but we need to be in all of the schools. We need to be talking about our kids, specifically about the dangers of pills, because it is a generational difference. Like when our generation was growing up, we didn't have a pill like this that would kill you. And also, we didn't have to educate our children about, hey, this is what a potential opioid overdose looks like and how to deploy Narcan. I mean, we're asking a lot of our kids, but that's where we are.
I think when you talk about our generation, folks in their 30s and 40s, in some ways, the way we look at these drugs is not as much of a big deal as I think we should be looking at these drugs. You know, people are like, oh, when I was in college, I would smoke, and that wasn't a big deal. Here I am right now, a professional. And I think the drugs have become so much more potent. And as you mentioned, there are pills now that can actually kill people. And so when parents are afraid to confront their children and say, no, Sonny, you should not be taking this stuff because it will kill you, I think we're actually doing a disservice to our children.
I think that when you look at the cases of unfortunate kid fatalities, what we see is that there are always going to be opportunities to talk to our kids about the dangers of these drugs. Because the kids aren't dying because they're trying to consume fentanyl. The kids are dying because they're taking bad pills. So how can we try to educate our kids enough to say, hey, when you're at a party, you can't take a bad pill? Or, hey, even with a friend, and your friend says, I know where this pill came from, it's not a bad pill. And how can you risk that when we know that basically 1 out of every 2 pills contains a fatal amount of fentanyl?
Well, if parents themselves, are smoking weed around their kids, or the parents are working so hard to appear cool to their children, right? And it's like, oh, well, I've taken these things in college and it was so much fun. How can we expect our kids to not want to experiment with the same stuff? I think part of the language needs to be, the parents need to be actually parents and not, their kids' buddies about this stuff. And we need to protect our kids and, step up a little bit and say, you know what, I'm not going to touch this stuff and I'm not going to smoke this stuff and you shouldn't do it either because it can kill both of us.
Well, I think what there is, and you see this a lot in the discussions about fentanyl, the different words between overdose and poisoning. And I think using that word poisoning is effective in a lot of different ways because I agree that there is a cultural mindset about the recreational use of drugs. And what I try to impart to kids is that the idea that you can recreationally use pills is just not true. So ultimately, kids are going to make their own decisions. All we can do is try to educate them as much as possible. But this idea of just recreational drug use of that potential population of a particular class that may use this drug, we got to get to them and we got to talk to them. And we have to be able to, unfortunately, educate our kids about the signs of these overdoses so that when they're at a party and they see somebody, they recognize either to use Narcan or to call 911.
I want to talk a little bit about Narcan and some of my concerns about it, but let's just talk a little bit about what is this? What is Narcan? What does it do?
So it basically almost immediately reverses the impact of a fentanyl overdose, right? So it inhibits the particular part of the brain that's suffering from that particular fentanyl exposure. So in a lot of ways, I'll say this just from a personal level, it is a godsend that we have because it saves a tremendous number of lives. So it's something that I believe should be in schools, should be widely available because fentanyl is widely available. So we need to be able to save as many lives as possible. It's very easy to deploy. It's just like a nasal spray. So you put it in one nostril, you deploy it. They usually come in batches of 2 to be able to potentially save someone's life. But even if someone's overdosed and you provide them Narcan, you still need to call 911.
Where do you get something like this?
They've actually done a much better job of making it widely available. So now they're in schools, they're in pharmacies, they're in, CVSs, they're in libraries. I think that all the community stakeholders realize that we need to have Narcan available as much as possible in the community.
So if you take fentanyl by accident or on purpose and you realize that you can't breathe, then you would spray it into your nose? Would you do one spray?
Yeah, unfortunately, it would be unusual for someone who's consuming fentanyl or consuming a bad pill to be able to deploy Narcan on themselves. That's a possibility, but more likely somebody who's around, or in a lot of instances, paramedics or law enforcement professionals will deploy the Narcan to save somebody's life.
How long does it take from the moment of ingesting fentanyl to the moment of, possibly dying and not breathing anymore?
Yeah, so fentanyl affects your lungs and your heart. The signs and symptoms of fentanyl are pretty specific. So it's a drowsiness, it's an irregular breathing, you lose blood flow to your extremities and particularly your blue lips. You also have potentially gurgling going on. So it can happen relatively quickly and it can happen over a course of time. So it's difficult for me to say, you ingest fentanyl and it takes X amount of time because there's various doses of fentanyl in whatever you're taking. So moral of the story is that the symptoms of a fentanyl overdose we sort of recognize as part of the literature and as part of our experiences. But it's difficult if we're trying to educate kids about, hey, this is potentially a sign of an overdose.
And so if a friend seems to not be breathing well and you take it out and you spray it up their nose a couple of times, is there any risk in spraying it and actually not having fentanyl in your system?
I love that question. It's a great question. The answer is no. So if you err on the side of caution and deploy Narcan on somebody, it's not going to have some negative long-term health results. So if it's a question of, do I deploy Narcan or do I not deploy Narcan? Deploy Narcan. Do it and call 911.
Okay, so here's something I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is I know we're going with the assumption that people are going to probably consume fentanyl anyway. And so let's give them Narcan and tell them that there is a solution that if they consume fentanyl, they can actually spray something up their nose and they'll be fine. My worry is that if teenagers hear that message, they're maybe even more likely to consume fentanyl, thinking that there is a solution that will reverse it. I mean, is that a risk that you guys are thinking about?
So I think we're talking about two separate populations. So for the kids, I'm not particularly worried about that because kids aren't trying to ingest fentanyl. So if they see somebody at a party who's demonstrating the signs and symptoms of a fentanyl overdose, they're going to deploy Narcan, and it doesn't affect that individual who hopefully is saved's ability to consume or desire to consume fentanyl because they weren't trying to consume fentanyl in the first place. The population I think that you're most directly asking about is the people whose drug of choice is especially powdered fentanyl. And that is a huge concern because these individuals are trying to consume powdered fentanyl. And I would say as a society, we still have a duty to try to save these people's lives. And we see, again, unfortunately in statistics, that people will overdose multiple times, and they'll be saved with Narcan multiple times. But that's where we have to have our entire community together to provide paths for treatment, rehabilitation, and to get people away from fentanyl. Because people can recover from fentanyl, right? People can recover from substance use disorders. It's just unfortunate that because the stakes are now so high, now that fentanyl is their drug of choice. This is an incredibly complicated problem, and I don't think that there's 100% a right answer. But what I would say is that we know that Narcan works, and we know that Narcan saves lives. And it ultimately is our responsibility as a society to try to protect kids in every way we can. So even if kids are going to use, and we know that some kids are going to use because we've unfortunately seen the experience of losing so many kids, we got to do everything we can to save lives. So it's a delicate balancing act, but I do think that the availability of Narcan is something that is meaningful in our communities.
Are you working with the schools or with media, aside from PragerU, to get the information out there? And what kind of messaging are you trying to get out with regards to saving these kids from fentanyl and all the other pills that they're buying through TikTok and social media and wherever it is that they're buying things?
And obviously, we appreciate the opportunity to be here today. But look, especially in the Southern District of California, which is what I can most directly speak to because that's where I work and live, we take an incredibly important role for being in the community and working with the District Attorney's Office, the San Diego County Board of Educations, the different particular, both the community service organizations, whether it's the homeless outreach teams or the individuals who are getting into schools. We need to be everywhere because the story of fentanyl is not being told. And sometimes the noise about fentanyl is so loud that we really want to be there to be able to dispel myths, like the Halloween myth, right? That's something that I understand because we all want to protect kids, but sometimes crowds out some of the more specific messages because fentanyl is incredibly dangerous and is dangerous enough if we're telling the stories that need to be told.
Right. So if we exaggerate to make our point, we actually don't get to make the real point that we need to make.
And 100%. And if we're trying to relate to kids and we're trying to tell kids what's actually going on, if we're using scare tactics is unfair because the seizures are the seizures. But if we're not focusing on what's actually causing the fatalities, then we're losing potentially the credibility when we're trying to reach and talk to our kids.
So what advice would you give to parents whose kids are not currently on drugs, but are probably entering into the teenage years where they're on social media, they're going to parties? What do you think we should tell our kids?
You got to talk to them about fentanyl early and often. It has to be part of the conversation. And I wish this was something about recreational drug use or alcohol or vaping. I'm not in a position to talk about any of that. What I can tell you is that we need to be specifically talking about our kids and about fentanyl because we're losing way too many kids.
And what about assuming that they may not know that there's fentanyl in what they're buying? It seems like we need to talk to them about the other pills that they might be buying, knowing that fentanyl might be in it.
Right. The message to kids, to me, starting in 6th grade on, maybe even 5th grade, is listen, any pill you take is going to be a significant risk of being a counterfeit pill. And if it is a counterfeit pill, more likely it's going to have fentanyl in it, which obviously increases dramatically the risk associated with just recreationally using a pill.
I can't think of a time that's been scarier to be a parent between social media and all these drugs and all these pills and everything that is going on right now. It just feels like there's an attack on our children from all directions. So really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. And, I hope that PragerU can be helpful in sharing some of this information out there. And I hope that the schools are partnering with you. I see them, very focused on teaching all kinds of other things to children. I hope they'll start teaching some of these things that can really help save our kids' lives.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks.